This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better.
What does it mean to be a man in 2025? In many countries around the world, men have greater flexibility than ever to express and practice their masculinity. And yet, research shows that men are struggling. Across their lives, from education to mental health and employment, they're falling behind. Stats into Australian men's mental health are particularly alarming, with Beyond Blue finding that 43% of men will experience depression or anxiety at some stage in their lives. 26% will delay seeing a doctor for help, and 7 out of 9 people who die every day by suicide are men. Violent extremism is also on the rise, in part magnified by radical influences like Andrew Tate, who espouse polarising gender rhetoric across social media. Gender is always in motion, but is masculinity in crisis? If so, how did it get here? More importantly, where to for men from here? With me today to explore this complex topic are Dr. Ben Rich and Todd Morley from Curtin University. Ben is a senior lecturer in the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry and co-director of the Curtin Extremism Research Network. Todd Morley is a PhD researcher also in the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry. He is also an external practitioner and consultant in preventing and countering violent extremism. As always, if you'd like to find out more about this topic, you can visit the links provided in the show notes. Ben, welcome back, and Todd, welcome to the podcast. Gentlemen, first of all, let me just say we've got a raft of massive questions to cover today. What an issue this is. Ben, what's going on with men today? What are some of the challenges that, well, the question says they're dealing with, but what are we dealing with as men, and what are the impacts that these challenges are having on how we see ourselves?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Look, I think there's a term that's becoming quite in vogue in larger and larger portions of the academy, termed as polycrisis. And this is the idea that you don't have a single crisis going on. You indeed have a multitude of crises occurring simultaneously, which have all sorts of weird interactions and impacts. And I think when we look at the status of men, and particularly young men today, we might sort of typify that as one of these manifestations of polycrisis. I think undergirding what we're seeing today is the fact that men's roles in society are increasingly uncertain, unmoored. What it is to be considered to be a successful man is increasingly hard to define. And, you know, people talk about this idea of the crisis of masculinity, and as if this is a modern phenomenon. What we actually know, if you look historically speaking, when we see periods of major economic and social transformation, oftentimes you see a corresponding manifestation, a crisis of masculinity. So if we say go back to the 1950s, when we see the sort of the rise of white collar work, you know, sort of the early emergence of things like deindustrialization, you actually have a whole series of sort of publications and advertisements kind of talking about the increasing feminization of men. And then obviously at the same time, you have sort of the period of second wave feminism and all the sort of progressive values and wins that are starting to emerge for women. But if we look at today, we can see that, you know, we're in an environment where you have an increasing casualised work, and something that has often been historically sort of attributed to a sort of strong sense of masculinity and a strong sense of purpose for men is linked to work. And the reality is the sort of the job market that's increasingly facing everyone, but is one in which you are thinking of having somewhere between anywhere between 10 and 20 jobs your entire life. So how do you plan for that? How do you build a sense of achievement out of that? There's some interesting data out there we can sort of see this reflected in. There was some stuff put out by the ABS in sort of the last year or so. It showed that 54% of men aged between 16 and 29 are still living at home with their parents. When we compare and contrast that with women, that's 47%. So that's nearly a 10% differentiation between men and women in those same brackets. We can see in education, men are increasingly falling behind. So we know that today overall university enrollments have basically inverted from the 1970s when men were, outstripping women. Now it is overall men are less in university education than women. This is not the case universally. Obviously, there are places in tertiary education like engineering, which is still heavily representing to men. You see things like suicide rates and deaths of despair. So those are deaths relating to things like drug overdoses. Overwhelmingly, I think the last data I saw was 8 out of 10 men, and that's particularly acute in young men. And you also have this phenomenon known as NEET, not in education, employment, or training otherwise. So this is the idea that you're not working and you're not taking any steps to actually engage in work. You're basically dropping out of the economy. And we know this is, again, a phenomenon that affects men significantly more than it affects women. So I think there's all this sort of data that's pointing to there's sort of the prospects of young men are diminishing, and in many cases actually falling behind women at the same time. And we have a sort of discourse nationally, and I think, throughout the West, asking, like men need to be more in touch with their feelings. They need to be, be willing to be more vulnerable. And I think we're very good at telling men that. We're not necessarily good at accommodating that when they do that. And one of the things I sort of have discussions with, particularly with as an educator, is the continual experience of young men sort of putting themselves out there, trying to do that, and then society very coldly kind of pushes them away and makes them feel unseen, and basically says you just got to pull your socks up and stuff like that. So there's a sort of disconnect between how we expect men to behave and the actual realities, the lived experience, if you will, when they hit the ground. And I think what this is doing is that's pushing them towards more extreme spaces online, where they feel like they can actually open themselves to other people who are willing to actually hear their story and to say there is some validity in what they're experiencing. And I think the final element I would add is there has been also a real, what we term in international relations as a securitization of masculinity, this idea that men somehow represent a kind of latent threat that, needs to be kind of dealt with as if they're going to go off at any particular moment, or almost like a kind of like Catholic guilt for masculinity, like you need to apologize for being male. And I think that might feel good, particularly for some advocates in particular spaces, but I also think that's heavily alienating, particularly if you're a young guy who's sort of coming up, you're trying to make sense of the world.
And that's what you're hearing. Yeah. Well, look, generationally, though, what this immediately raises for me, these alarming stats, this data that you're putting in front of us today, Ben, is generationally, is there so much difference that the previous generation of men are maybe not as equipped, as is necessary to advise and to mentor this current generation of young men, maturing now? Is it generationally that markedly different, these set of circumstances?
Well, you hear that a lot when you engage, particularly online. There is a feeling that the advice of sort of the Gen X to the Gen Z really just doesn't stack up in terms of things like dating, in terms of things like employment. Like there is a real divergence between the experience of someone growing up in the 70s and 80s versus what what is being encountered today. I mean, I take even my experience, I'm an elder millennial, and I really am glad I grew up in a sort of mostly internet period. Those formative years of sort of being in my teens were mostly spent offline. There was a degree towards the end that it wasn't, but it certainly wasn't in the environment that we see today, particularly if we talk about things like social media and the sort of self-perception and the kind of confidence or lack of confidence that instills and the values that it instills in the people who are consuming it.
Todd, Ben talks about this confluence of different factors, this technology, this change in the social fabric as a result. And we also can stack that up against men's status having changed over time. Men have historically held positions of power. And should we be viewing these challenges today as something necessary that men kind of need to experience to understand what marginalised groups have experienced in the past and are still experiencing today?
I think that's a fantastic way to look at it. I think it's important as well to note that one of the best theorists in this space going back several decades now, Ted Robert Gurr, has this idea of relative deprivation theory, which is to say that even if you are in a position of power, privileged, as a lot of men have been over history, that doesn't mean that when you lose that relative status, it doesn't hurt just as much, which is to say that a lot of men materially, particularly in the first world, are still materially quite well off. But the loss of that opportunity and seeing previous generations having had more opportunity, that is still very acutely felt for young people, even if they do feel that they are still very much on the top of that sort of hierarchy. And I think on the perception front as well, it's important to note that as men, I think when we're talking about the ways that we conceptualize gender in particular, women have had a head start in asking these questions. If we look back to the most sort of seminal gender studies works, they are largely around articulating what it means to be a woman in opposition to what is being a man, and that has largely been considered to be the starting point for most sort of inquiry. Now we're seeing these questions being asked that women have been grappling with and non-gender conforming people have been grappling with for decades, and we don't have the language, we don't have the tools to articulate what it means to be a man, what the boundaries of that masculinity looks like, and we're in a bit of a growing pains process at the moment trying to find the language to articulate ourselves in that way.
Or even in some cases to even validate whether or not the discussion should be being had at all, right?
Absolutely.
Which again is a really interesting and fraught element of this entire discussion, I think. Ben, you alluded to social media and having grown up without being online for the most part of your teenage and formative years. Can you give us a bit of an insight into how social media is affecting perceptions of masculinity? Todd's sort of given us a nice springboard into that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have this report by Movember released last year. You can find it on the ABC if you do a bit of Googling, that suggested that roughly 70% of young men today, 16 to 25, consume some form of masculinity influencer content. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the manosphere as we sort of the more extreme aspects of it, but something that is sort of advising you how to be a young man, how to be a man, how to be successful as a man. And I compare and contrast that with my experience growing up as a teenager. These just weren't questions I was thinking about. Like I just, I was riding around, like literally the neighborhood with my friends and playing Nintendo 64 and, not being confronted with this bombardment. So I think what we're seeing is like the social media in particular is this kind of consciousness razor where it's creating this awareness or this sense in people that this is something we really have to grapple with. And I think going back to the previous point when we talked about this idea of, the concept of femininity and sort of its development over the 20th century, one thing I think it's really important to add to that is this is happening largely, particularly in the West, against a backdrop of the growth of investment in public state education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we're seeing now with, the sort of questions around masculinity is it's happening during a time of, economic decline. It's happening at a time when we're seeing the state with, pull back from things like social welfare systems and stuff like that. So it instills it with a real sense of competition, as opposed to sort of almost like a rising tide, lifts all boats kind of mentality. So a very different kind of almost a malaise surrounding the emergence of this consciousness. One of the things you really see with a lot of the social media stuff, not all, I would say there are some positive sort of masculinity influences out there, but a big chunk of it is embedded in this notion of like performative status. And you see this, Andrew Tate's like kind of the patient zero of this, you've got to perform your masculinity, you've got to perform your success, you've got to have, the multiple Bugattis, you have to have the, just beautiful made up women hanging around you constantly, you have to have the six pack, you have to be talking in this very authoritative, aggressive way that's asserting yourself. And that's a very appealing thing for a lot of young men who are dealing with a lot of uncertainty in their lives, to have this kind of authoritative drill sergeant-like figure with all these sort of very clear symbols of their success who can telling you how to be just like them, to sort of wash away all those uncertainties that are in life and are increasingly in life. And you are more and more aware of this when you consume social media every day, but all the things that are uncertain.
Well, it's such a visual thing, isn't it? So when it's populated with such appealing images, it's hard to look away. In amongst all of that, Ben, is the notion of extremists' beliefs or extremism, is that the logical progression when you go down a social media rabbit hole? Can that be a net result? And let's start with what extremism actually is as a definition.
It's a great question. Being the director of the Curtin Extremism Research Network, I probably should be more certain about this, but this extremism is one of those slippery terms. We talk about it as being essentially contested in the social sciences, and this is the idea that no two people are ever going to agree 100% on what extremism means. One of the things we can know about it is it's often used as a kind of pejorative. It's in many ways taken the place of terrorism and terrorist. That was the sort of global war on terror period where that was the way you sort of delegitimized your opposition, and sort of if someone was saying something you didn't like, or someone saying something you don't like, you just call them extremists, write them off, and then you don't have to really think about the quality of their argument or anything like that. I would say fundamentally what extremism is at its heart is it's a belief in an anti-liberal democratic, worldview. It's the idea that you want to essentially disestablish the sort of open progressive structures of our society. It's different from radicalism. So a good example, I would consider someone like Pauline Hanson is a radical right actor. But at the end of the day, as far as I know, Pauline Hanson is not calling for the downfall of the liberal democratic nature of the Australian state, whereas an extremist would see the democracy that we live in as an impediment to their idealised political view. Also important to say, extremism is not always violent in nature. There are people that, fundamentally are against democracy, but feel that this needs to be pursued through non-violent means. A classic example of this we look in the Australian and sort of UK context is the Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, which, explicitly calls for a caliphate, but also mostly has stepped away from, encouraging activities linked to like jihadism and stuff like that. That being said, they often inform one another. It's, I think, quite easy to have an extremist worldview and come to view violence as a legitimate means of redressing or to achieving that. But it's important to note that it's not always the case. And we have to be quite careful when we talk about and we classify people and we put people into these categories that we really understand the nature of their beliefs and their views on violence and things like that. And unfortunately, or by the nature of a liberal democratic society, sometimes you have to just accept that extremists are a part of the framework, the fabric, and it's probably something Todd can talk about with his background a bit more, but as long as they're not moving to that step of utilising violence. I think one of the things that we're trying to do when we engage with discussions around masculinity at the moment is avoid dropping the extremist label on people who are sort of in and around spaces like the manosphere. There's often a sort of a tendency to, look at particularly these kind of weird subcultures and say this is an extremist group. A great example of this is there is a generally held belief in society that incels or involuntary celibates, which are a part of the manosphere space, are just extremist by their nature. And this hasn't been helped by the release of Adolescence, the very popular Netflix show a few months ago.
Frightening.
Yeah, it is, but if you look at a particular paper that was released a few months ago, it found that the majority of incels who were, I think it was an end study of around about 500, the majority of them self-reported their worldviews as centrist or left of centre. So not even, far right or anything like that associated with that. So it's really important that we kind of understand the nature of these groups and their beliefs rather than just throw them away because they have one particular worldview.
So to clarify, Ben, are we talking about extremism through the lens of masculinity, as in extremists in the sense that there are measures to the nth degree with which a certain brand of masculinity can be restored that resembles masculinity from a different era? Or are we talking about extremism in the sense that there are political groups that, as part of their agenda or their belief system, are, I guess, fostering a notion, again, as part of their overall belief system that men have a certain place in the world and in the social order, and then that in itself provides an avenue of belonging for disaffected men. Can you clarify that for me?
I would say it's both. I would say it's a frustrating thing. And this is part of the challenge of dealing with extremism today, is that there's such a degree of cross-pollination and there's such a sort of set of often very unique rabbit holes people go down because of targeted algorithms. But you have, groups on like the alt-right and their descendants today that, have representations including the Trump administration in the United States, who do espouse a certain kind of very extreme restorative masculinity that sort of has this idealized notion of the past of the place of the wife is in the kitchen raising the children with basically no political representation, almost going back to the images that the initial founding fathers had and who was allowed to partake politically and who wasn't. You then have specific subgroups in online masculine communities who this is their one issue and this is the thing that they focus on. And sometimes you see, looking at the profiles of these people, they'll start in one and they'll migrate to each other. So it's one of the real challenges that we have epistemically in our field at the moment, is how do we classify these things coherently? And the more you go into it, the less confident you are that you can really create like a nice sort of spreadsheet applicable model.
Well, Todd, I guess we've alluded to how some forms of extremism can manifest, but can you expand on that? How do these beliefs manifest through the research that you've done?
So it's a very tricky question, and I think it's one of these moments where we have to pause and just flag that when we're talking about behavioural indicators of extremism, they really do have to be looked at holistically with the rest of the person's circumstances. So your typical sort of warning sign behaviours wouldn't necessarily, they seem relatively innocuous on their face, but it is entirely context dependent, right? A lot of the research we've done and people we've spoken to professionally in sort of education spaces in particular will report particularly young men in the classroom environment sort of disregarding or actively fighting against female teachers. Perhaps they're actually visiting violence upon other students. But often you'll find that these indicators are actually quite innocuous on their face, in the sense that they can be withdrawing, particularly more towards online spaces, away from your typical social engagements. We could talk about the ways that they might hoard extremist material of some sort, right? Not necessarily just consuming content, but consuming it at a rate and sort of holding on to it at a rate that would be overpowering to the rest of their worldview, in a sense, right? The sort of person that can have a conversation with them and they will always find a way to turn it into that specific interest. But again, these behavioural indicators, it really does depend on who is actually observing them. You'll find that particularly when we're in talking about education spaces, teachers and parents or other people that will know first when behaviour is showing a real shift, a novel shift away from previous behaviours. But typically you'll find that it's actually not very common to see violence, physical violence per se. A lot of the time it is that behavioural shift towards women in particular in their life, so their mothers and female teachers in particular, disregard, active hostility. Maybe they're actually fighting them more regularly and using quite nasty language. You won't often see that sort of physical violence manifest until they're much further down that sort of rabbit hole and they're much more isolated, and a lot of other factors have come in to isolate them in that way.
The internet has been such a wonderful tool for all of us to research, but in the case of masculinity and searching for answers, what role is the internet playing, especially in terms of it being a bit of an echo chamber at times? Is this the fuel and the foundation that perhaps is, I guess, adding momentum to some of the issues we're looking at today?
I think momentum's the right word. I think it's important to note when we're talking about the internet's role that I think it's in vogue recently to try and legislate our way out of people's internet use. And I don't think that's somewhat missing the point when we talk about the internet's role in the radicalisation process specifically, because I think the term we need to use is that it's an accelerant. That these are usually narratives that are finding people in already vulnerable positions, and the access and volume to content that the internet provides really does accelerate the process of that sort of belief and then eventual behavioural shift. But it is not the root cause of it per se, and I don't think we can legislate our way out of the problem on that front, in the sense that it's great to limit internet access to a lot of people sometimes, particularly younger people, right? We know that there's a lot of research that says that consistent online engagement from a young age can actually radically shape their development. But to say that if we, for example, place a social media ban in place for young people, that will immediately redress all of the underlying concerns that will drive them into these spaces to begin with. So really, I would say that it's an accelerant more than anything, but it is one element of a much more holistic problem.
Well, as you have both mentioned or explained at length, there are so many different circumstances and contributing factors to why we find ourselves here. You've just pointed out some of the behaviours and indicators that you've been able to highlight in your research. What sort of work have you done with organisations outside of Curtin to de-radicalise some of the young men that have gone down the rabbit hole, so to speak?
So my previous professional experience, I've worked with the West Australia Intervention Support Program, which is a government-funded intervention program that is targeted towards people that are vulnerable or at risk of violent radicalisation. I think it's important to note on language here that program itself is a disengagement program and not a de-radicalisation program. And it might sound like a relatively innocuous difference, but it's important to note here in the sense that de-radicalisation, when we discuss that, what we're talking about is the changes of attitudes and beliefs, which is, through all the research we've seen, is a very difficult to measure process and can take on a timescale of many, many years. What these programs are is essentially a consensual therapeutic engagement with an individual that is focused on moderating their behaviours specifically. We're not looking to change people's minds. They're looking to make sure that there's no behavioural manifestations that could result in violence. So how you achieve that is essentially, as I was saying before around the internet, addressing root causes. So looking to the specific needs and vulnerabilities that are making that young person or adult at risk, and looking to create holistic wraparound care to redress those in a pro-social way. So the intent would be essentially that you are addressing those root causes in the sense that the person will naturally walk away from those beliefs as their life improves.
Well, Ben, what about positive change? What can men do to, I guess, regain some agency and some autonomy in making better choices that will benefit them in the long run?
Well, I think it's more of a broader social question. I would say I'd probably be a bit careful with the sort of the bootstraps implication of what can men do. I think there needs to be a kind of whole of society response here. I think there's some small sort of localized things. I am heavily critical of the modern existence of single gender schools. I just think those are a thing of the past. And I think part of the success of a lot of masculinity influences, particularly the ones that want to drive that wedge between men and women, rely on the fact that a lot of young men don't have a lot of experience of young women just in their day-to-day lives. And so it's almost like they're almost like mystified. So I think those things really need to be maybe put in the past where they belong. I think in the education space itself, we need to start to think about, particularly in the primary and secondary spaces, teaching plans which focus on group work that are explicitly about pairing up boys and girls together so they get used to just being around each other. They get used to understanding the different views and the different experiences of each other. Creating spaces in education to talk about, how the different genders experience events in the world and stuff like that. So a real kind of familiarization, because I think what we see with, guys like Andrew Tate and his kind of ilk, because they're very much about creating this notion of the sort of the unknowable woman, or the woman that is a completely non-human, a non-entity, there's no comparison. And I think finding those commonalities are really, really important, building that sense of respect, that sense of empathy. At a sort of middle level, I think education, particularly for young men, around the tactics used by manosphere influencers to recruit them. So we actually put a paper out about this a couple of years ago that you guys might want to put on the show notes, that looked at basically showing the process by which guys like Andrew Tate sort of entrap young men, pull them into these communities and create a sort of sense of crisis that keeps them bound in those communities, keeps them looking to the influencer as a figure of authority, and just indoctrinates them more and more into those worldviews.
It's incredibly strategic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And much like the way that has been shown to be successful in the past of breaking people out of cults, showing people how the actual sausage is made and not telling them that they are wrong specifically for being there, but showing them how these processes work and allowing them to actually understand where they are in that process. Oftentimes that will cause them. I also think, though, a lot of this stuff is kind of putting Band-Aids on, femoral wounds if we don't address broader issues. And these are things like public spending. These are things like making sure young people can, buy houses at the early times that their parents are able to, opportunities for young people. Again, I take a very much like, a rising tide lifts all boats kind of approach. And I think, unfortunately, what's going to happen is if we keep going through these and get in these conditions of depredation, you will get more and more spin-off groups, creating a particular worldview, more and more extreme, based on a particular identity structure. And that's just a natural outcome of that sort of wider social breakdown that we see. So there are things we can do locally, but this is again, whole of society response. And I think addressing a lot of these deeper issues in society, a lot of these sort of local manifestations will actually diminish without necessarily having to go at them directly.
Well, given what you've presented with us today, gentlemen, it's all looking pretty freaking bleak. What does the modern man actually look like to each of you? Let's start with you, Todd. What is the modern man, and is there a model that we should aspire to, or is it an entirely individual thing?
Geez, how much time do we have? I think the question is probably more important than the answer, if that makes sense. The fact that we're asking the question, I think back to even a decade ago in my teens when we were just having these discussions around what modern masculinity is. The conversation is already leaps and bounds ahead of where it was, and I think it's only getting better. But I don't think there is a clear answer, and I think the ambiguity of that is almost part of the point, in the sense that it is the rigidity of that idea of masculinity that has been the undermining force here and has led to some really toxic outcomes. And I think being able to re-articulate what that means individually or collectively is going to be a long process, as it was for the feminist movement in the 20th century. But it is a process that can be done personally and collectively, and it doesn't have to have one answer. And I think that's probably the point that we need to focus on, in the sense that if we create another rigid archetype of what it means to be a man, it's only going to come up against the material reality in which we live. I think that's probably the best answer we have for the moment, because I don't think I've got one. I don't think I've got a satisfying answer for anyone, unfortunately.
And Ben, how about you? What is your view on what the modern man is and the shape that he takes?
I'm not comfortable with the notion of a universalist modern man. I think the modern man is one who deals with constant ambiguity about what a modern man is, and some react very well to that and are very comfortable with that, and others are deeply unsettled by that and search for surety in an environment which is defined by ambiguity and uncertainty. One of the things that we're working on at the moment is, how do you effectively counter message the people that will really try to bring on what we would think of from our perspective as the worst aspects of masculinity out? And how do we find actors in this space that are organic, that are not, a government, counter-messaging campaign, because we know those just don't really work very well, and they're often seen as deeply inauthentic. How do you find people that speak to these insecurities and these grievances in a way that has a positive vision of self-actualization and community actualization? Because this is the other thing. I think the modern environment is defined by alienation, individualization, sort of the economic structures we occupy want us all out there competing one another and feeling constantly insecure. I say this as a union organizer, so I have a certain particular position on this. But how do we find ways to bring people together around these issues and try and deal with them in a sort of a positive, collective way. A paper that we're working on at the moment looks at a particular online influencer. Some of the listeners may know by the name of Hassan Piker. He's a sort of left-leaning. He's kind of bro-y, but he sort of talks about these things in a way that is not about, a kind of us versus them, versus in the context of, the gender wars and stuff like that. And I think that is increasingly my view, that like this is one of the only ways that these kind of messages are going to be counteracted, and we're going to find ways to bring people together. Maybe it won't work, maybe it will, but I don't think a government plan of, I believe there was a podcast the Australian government tried to put out called The Man Shed, which kind of fell on its face quite heavily because it just was so inauthentic and alienating to the viewership.
It sounds like a plotline out of Utopia.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So are you in essence describing the ongoing work of the Curtin Extremism Research Network is really these questions and these strategies that you're posing here? Is that the work that you'll be continuing to do?
Yeah, that's fundamentally what CERN is about. Like we're basically our whole raison d'etre is trying to understand why is the world feeling more extreme in all sorts of aspects, including in the gender space, but in race, economics, et cetera, and what are strategies that can be undertaken? What is an effective way to push back on this? This is absolutely a sort of sub-part of what we're working on.
Gentlemen, this has been fascinating, and it's a conversation that needs to be revisited, within the next couple of years at the very latest, I think, because it is a space that is, as you've both have intimated, constantly changing, and that men are needing to constantly adapt to. And look, we really appreciate you both taking the time to chat with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And don't forget to subscribe to The Future Of on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.